Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to dive headfirst into a topic that's been a source of intense discussion and debate for years.
Oh, yeah.
Does DNA evidence support the authenticity of the Book of Mormon?
It's a question that really intersects faith, science, and history.
And we've got a mountain of research articles and even personal perspectives from both faithful and doubting Mormons to help us unpack it all.
What's so fascinating about this deep dive is that we're not just looking at dry data, but we're also grappling with how scientific discoveries interact with personal beliefs.
Yeah, good guy.
So we're going to examine the arguments for and against the Book of Mormon's historicity based on DNA evidence.
You ready to put on your thinking caps?
Oh, yeah.
And maybe even challenge some long-held assumptions?
I'm ready.
Because here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
To make this deep dive as engaging as possible,
Yeah.
we're going to approach this like a formal debate.
Okay.
We'll each take a side.
Okay.
DNA evidence supports the Book of Mormon versus DNA evidence does not support the Book of Mormon, and present our cases complete with arguments, counter-arguments, and rebuttals.
So like a courtroom.
Think of it as a courtroom where logic and evidence are the ultimate judges.
I like it.
I'm going to argue that DNA evidence does support the Book of Mormon,
Okay.
while you'll present the case that it does not.
All right. I'm ready.
Ready to make your opening statement?
Let's start by acknowledging the dominant theory in the scientific community. The idea that the majority of indigenous populations in the Americas descended from a single primary migration of people from Asia across the Bering Strait.
Correct. The genetic evidence overwhelmingly supports this theory.
Yeah.
We see it consistently in studies of mitochondrial DNA,
Right.
like chromosome DNA and autosomal DNA.
Yeah.
However, the Book of Mormon never claims that Lehi's group and other Book of Mormon peoples were the only line-led people in the Americas.
Okay.
In fact, there are hints within the text itself that suggest the presence of other groups.
Interesting. Could you give us an example of those hints?
Absolutely. One compelling piece of evidence comes from a statement by Anthony W. Ivans,
Okay.
a member of the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, from the April 1929 General Conference.
Yeah.
She said, and I quote,
Okay.
"We must be careful in the conclusions that we reach.
Right.
The Book of Mormon does not tell us that there was no one here before them, the peoples it describes.
Okay.
It does not tell us that people did not come after."
Okay. So this suggests an awareness, even among early church leaders,
Right.
that the Book of Mormon narrative doesn't preclude the existence of other groups in the Americas,
Exactly.
including those who might have arrived via the Bering Strait.
So you're proposing that the Book of Mormon narrative allows for the presence of those East Asian populations alongside the groups described in the book.
Exactly.
Precisely.
And?
And there's more.
Okay.
The Book of Mormon itself hints at a potential blending of lineages, which could explain why distinct genetic markers from Lehi's group might be difficult to detect today.
Could you elaborate on that?
Let's look at the allegory of the olive tree, found in Jacob chapter 5. The allegory describes the grafting of branches from a tame olive tree, representing Israel, onto wild olive trees.
Right.
This could be interpreted as a symbolic representation of Lehi's group, a branch of Israel, mixing and blending with pre-existing populations in the Americas,
I see.
represented by the wild olive trees.
So you're suggesting that the act of grafting, as described in this allegory, could represent the mixing of lineages between Lehi's group and the people who were already present in the Americas.
Right.
This intermingling, you argue, could explain the lack of easily identifiable genetic markers specific to Lehi's group in modern populations.
Exactly.
Okay.
However, even with this potential mixing, shouldn't there still be some detectable trace of Middle Eastern DNA in indigenous populations if the Book of Mormon is historically accurate?
That's a very valid question.
Yeah.
And it brings us to the limitations of scientific tools like the molecular clock used to date migrations.
Right.
While incredibly useful, this clock isn't always precise enough to pinpoint events that happened just a few thousand years ago.
Okay.
And when it comes to complete genomes, there's no reliable clock at all.
So you're suggesting that the molecular clock while useful for understanding broad migration patterns, might not be sensitive enough to detect the specific genetic traces of a smaller group like Lehi's family who arrived thousands of years ago.
Precisely.
But even if we acknowledge the limitations of the molecular clock, the scientific community still generally agrees that the primary ancestry of indigenous populations in the Americas originates in East Asia.
That's true, but that doesn't rule out the possibility of smaller migrations, does it?
True science doesn't completely dismiss that possibility.
In fact, there's a 2010 study about a 4,000-year-old Paleo-Eskimo in Greenland that led to the hypothesis of a migration distinct from the primary one from East Asia. The researchers discovered a unique genetic profile that wasn't present in other indigenous populations.
Okay.
They concluded that this individual belonged to a previously unknown group that had migrated to the Americas separate from the main East Asian wave.
So while the primary genetic evidence points to an East Asian origin for most indigenous populations, this study demonstrates that there could have been other smaller migrations that left distinct genetic traces.
Right.
The Book of Mormon could fall into this category of smaller migrations, even if those traces are difficult to detect with current technology.
That's a thought-provoking point.
Yeah.
You're suggesting that the Book of Mormon narrative could be consistent with the scientific evidence if we consider the possibility of multiple migrations.
Right.
Some of which may have been too small or too ancient to be easily detectable with current genetic analysis techniques.
However, the burden of proof still lies with demonstrating the existence of such a migration through credible genetic or archaeological data.
Right.
Currently, the evidence for a distinct migration of a group with Middle Eastern origins, as described in the Book of Mormon, is lacking.
Okay, I see your point, but we're just getting started.
Yeah.
There are other intriguing aspects to consider, especially when we factor in the historical context surrounding the Book of Mormon and its interpretations within the church.
Right.
Let's dive into that next.
Sounds good to me. Let's explore that further. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the historical context surrounding some key church pronouncements that relate to the Book of Mormon and its claims about indigenous populations.
Okay.
Specifically, let's examine the 1845 proclamation of the 12 Apostles,
Right.
which explicitly states that Native Americans are of Israelite descent.
That's a significant document historically.
Yeah.
But how do you reconcile it with the lack of clear genetic evidence connecting Native Americans to the Middle East?
There are a few potential interpretations that could bridge the gap between this proclamation and current scientific findings. First, the proclamation could be viewed as a statement of ultimate destiny for Native Americans.
Interesting.
Rather than a literal claim about their immediate geographical origins or DNA.
You're suggesting that the proclamation might be speaking to a spiritual lineage or a future gathering?
Exactly.
Rather than a purely biological ancestry.
It could be about their place in God's plan, not necessarily their precise genetic makeup at a given point in time.
I see. So you're suggesting that the proclamation should be interpreted more metaphorically than literally.
Precisely.
Okay.
And second, we could view the proclamation as a historical document.
Right.
Reflecting the understanding of the quorum of the 12 at that time.
Okay.
Not necessarily a binding doctrinal statement for all eternity.
I see. You're proposing that the proclamation might be a product of its time, influenced by the prevailing knowledge and perspectives of that era.
Right.
However, how do you reconcile this interpretation with the concept of continuing revelation in the church?
Yeah, that's a great question.
If pronouncements from church leaders can become outdated or reinterpreted, what does that say about the authority of those pronouncements?
That's a great question, and it leads us to another crucial point.
Okay.
The proclamation was never canonized.
Okay.
Meaning it's not part of the official scriptural canon of the church.
That's right. The scriptures themselves, particularly the Doctrine and Covenants, emphasize the canon as the standard of law for the church.
Precisely.
Okay.
This distinction between canonized scripture and other pronouncements or teachings is significant.
Right.
It suggests that while the proclamation holds historical importance, it might not carry the same weight as, say, the Book of Mormon itself.
Okay.
And finally, there's the intriguing possibility that the proclamation was a commandment that Joseph Smith, due to his martyrdom, was unable to fulfill. The Doctrine and Covenants has examples of commandments that, due to circumstances, were essentially rendered non-binding. For instance, the commandment to build a temple in Jackson County, Missouri, wasn't fulfilled within the specified time frame due to persecution and the saints being driven from the area.
That's a thought-provoking interpretation.
Right.
You're suggesting that the circumstances surrounding Joseph Smith's death
Right.
might have altered the trajectory of the commandment regarding the proclamation,
Right.
potentially rendering it non-binding.
Exactly.
Okay.
So while the 1845 proclamation presents a historical layer to this conversation, its interpretation remains open to discussion.
Okay.
And it doesn't necessarily contradict the potential for the Book of Mormon narrative to coexist with scientific discoveries about indigenous populations.
Those are some compelling points to consider.
Yeah.
But even if we set aside the proclamation and its interpretations, we still have to address the scientific evidence itself.
Right.
As we've discussed, the prevailing theory supported by genetic data indicates a primary ancestry for indigenous populations originating in East Asia.
That's true. But remember, we've also discussed the limitations of the molecular clock.
Right.
And the possibility of smaller, less detectable migrations.
Okay.
What if we explore some other scientific concepts that might provide further context?
Sounds good. What do you have in mind?
Let's talk about population bottleneck and genetic drift.
Okay.
These concepts are essential for understanding how genetic diversity can change over time,
Right.
especially within small and isolated populations.
Okay, let's break those down. First, population bottleneck.
Right.
What is that exactly?
Imagine a population suddenly shrinking dramatically,
Okay.
perhaps due to a natural disaster, disease outbreak, or migration.
Right.
This shrinking, or bottleneck, can drastically reduce genetic diversity within the population, even if it later rebounds in size.
So it's like a filter that only allows a fraction of the original genetic diversity to pass through.
Right.
And how does this relate to the Book of Mormon?
Well, the Book of Mormon describes several instances of war, famine, and migration, all of which could have created population bottlenecks.
Right.
These events might have significantly reduced the genetic diversity of the groups involved, potentially impacting our ability to detect distinct markers today, even if those markers were once present.
I see where you're going with this. But wouldn't those bottleneck events still leave some trace in the genetic record?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
That's where genetic drift comes in.
Okay, tell me more about genetic drift.
Genetic drift is essentially the random fluctuation of gene frequencies within a population over time.
Okay.
It's like a game of chance, where certain genes, even those representing a specific ancestry, might simply disappear due to pure randomness, especially in small populations.
So it's not just about external events like bottlenecks, but also the inherent randomness of how genes are passed down through generations.
Exactly.
Okay.
To illustrate this, imagine a jar filled with marbles of different colors, representing the various genetic profiles within a population. Each generation, you randomly draw a handful of marbles, representing the genes passed on to the next generation.
Okay, I'm picturing it. So even if we started with a jar representing a diverse population, over time, certain colors could become more or less prevalent, even disappearing altogether just by chance.
Precisely. And this effect is amplified in small, isolated populations.
Okay.
The smaller the population, the more susceptible it is to these random fluctuations in gene frequencies.
And isn't that relevant to the Book of Mormon?
Yes.
The founding group of Lehi's family was very small.
Right.
And they often describe themselves as being isolated from other groups.
That's a good point. The small size and relative isolation of the groups described in the Book of Mormon could indeed make them more susceptible to the effects of genetic drift, potentially leading to the loss of certain genetic markers over time.
And don't forget about the potential intermingling with larger pre-existing populations, like those who migrated from Asia. If a small group carrying distinct genetic markers mixes with a much larger group, their markers become diluted and harder to detect over generations.
Right. That dilution effect is key.
Yeah.
It's like adding a handful of brightly colored marbles to a jar already filled with thousands of plain white marbles.
Right.
Even if you shake the jar, those bright colors will quickly become nearly impossible to find.
So while we can't completely rule out the possibility that genetic markers from Book of Mormon peoples might have existed at some point, the combination of population bottlenecks, genetic drift, and intermingling with larger groups could explain why they're not readily apparent in modern populations.
However, while those factors can make markers difficult to detect, they don't typically erase all traces, particularly when dealing with larger populations like those described in the Book of Mormon. Remember, the book talks about significant population growth and numerous wars involving hundreds of thousands of people.
Right.
It's hard to imagine that every trace of a distinct genetic heritage would simply vanish.
That's true. But remember, those larger populations were the result of significant growth over many generations.
Right.
The initial founding group was still incredibly small,
Right.
making them particularly vulnerable to those early shifts in gene frequencies.
That's a fair point to consider.
But it raises another important question.
Okay.
If these factors were so influential, why do we see relatively intact genetic signals from other indigenous groups that have been in the Americas for even longer periods?
That's a great question, and one that requires careful consideration of the specific historical and demographic circumstances of each group.
Right.
We can't simply apply a one-size-fits-all explanation when it comes to genetics and population dynamics.
Exactly. Each group's history of migrations, intermingling, and potential bottlenecks needs to be evaluated within its own unique context.
Agreed. It's a complex puzzle with many pieces, and we're still trying to fit them all together.
Right.
But here's something else to consider. There's a fascinating study from Iceland that backs up these concepts of bottleneck and drift.
Okay.
Researchers there combined genetic and genealogical data and found that the majority of Icelanders today inherited mitochondrial DNA from only a small percentage of the people who lived there just 300 years ago.
I'm familiar with that study. It's a compelling example of how genetic drift can significantly impact the genetic makeup of a population over time, even within a relatively short time frame.
And it shows that even without complete erasure, genetic drift can dramatically shift the representation of certain lineages within a population. It's like a molecular game of telephone, where the message, in this case the genetic markers, gets slightly distorted with each passing generation. Eventually becoming unrecognizable.
So you're proposing that a similar process could have happened with the Book of Mormon populations, making their original genetic markers nearly impossible to detect today.
Exactly. It's a plausible explanation that aligns with scientific principles and real-world examples. While current DNA evidence may not point directly to a Middle Eastern origin for Book of Mormon peoples, it doesn't definitively exclude the possibility either. We have to consider these powerful forces of population, bottleneck, and genetic drift that could have significantly impacted the genetic landscape over centuries.
I acknowledge the validity of your points. Population bottleneck and genetic drift are indeed factors that can influence genetic diversity and the detectability of specific markers. However, the question remains, why do these factors seem to have affected only the Book of Mormon populations, while the genetic signals of other indigenous groups remain relatively intact?
That's a question that requires further research and analysis. We're still learning so much about the genetic history of population, and new discoveries are constantly changing our understanding.
Fair enough. But based on the current evidence, I still maintain that the most plausible explanation for the genetic makeup of indigenous populations in the Americas points to a primary ancestry in East Asia, with little to no indication of a significant migration from the Middle East, as described in the Book of Mormon.
Well, I respect your position. I believe the evidence is more open to interpretation than that. The Book of Mormon itself hints at the presence of other groups, and the concepts of bottleneck and drift provide scientifically sound explanations for why a distinct genetic signature from Lehi's group might be difficult to detect today.
This has been a very thought-provoking discussion.
It has been.
Let's move on to our closing arguments.
Well, we've reached the final round of our deep dive into DNA evidence and the Book of Mormon.
It has been a fascinating journey.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring complex scientific concepts and grappling with the interplay of faith and evidence. Now let's summarize our arguments and see if we can reach a verdict. In this case of DNA versus the Book of Mormon. I'll start. Throughout this discussion, I've argued that while current DNA evidence doesn't definitively prove the Book of Mormon, it doesn't disprove it either. The scientific data, when considered in its full complexity, leaves room for the possibility that a group like Lehi's family could have migrated to the Americas and left a genetic legacy that's difficult to detect today. The Book of Mormon never claims to be a complete historical record of all peoples in the Americas. It acknowledges the presence of other groups, and statements from early church leaders like Anthony W. Ivins support this interpretation. The allegory of the olive tree, with its emphasis on grafting and the mixing of lineages, further suggests that Lehi's group might have intermingled with pre-existing populations,
Right.
making their genetic markers harder to isolate.
Okay.
And we can't discount the significant impact of scientific concepts like population bottleneck and genetic drift. These forces, especially powerful in small and isolated groups, like those described in the Book of Mormon,
Right.
could have dramatically shifted the genetic landscape over time,
Okay.
potentially obscuring the original genetic signatures of Lehi's descendants.
Right.
The Iceland study, where researchers found that the majority of modern Icelanders inherited mitochondrial DNA from only a small fraction of their ancestors just 300 years ago,
Right.
provides a compelling, real-world example of how genetic drift can drastically alter the genetic makeup of a population,
Yes.
even within a relatively short time frame.
I agree.
While I acknowledge the strength of the scientific consensus pointing to a primary East Asian ancestry for most indigenous populations in the Americas,
Yeah.
I maintain that the possibility of smaller, less detectable migrations can't be ruled out.
Okay.
The Book of Mormon narrative, with its emphasis on small groups, isolation and intermingling,
Right.
fits within the parameters of these scientific concepts,
Okay.
leaving room for faith and scientific understanding to coexist.
That was a very well-structured summary of your arguments.
Yeah.
However, I still maintain that the burden of proof rests on those who claim the Book of Mormon's historicity.
Okay.
And as we've discussed, the current genetic evidence simply doesn't support the narrative of a significant migration from the Middle East to the Americas.
Okay.
While the concepts of population bottleneck and genetic drift are valid,
Right.
they don't typically erase all traces of a distinct genetic heritage,
Right.
particularly when dealing with the population sizes and growth rates described in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And the Iceland study, while intriguing, represents a very specific and isolated population.
Okay.
It's difficult to extrapolate those findings to the broader context of the Americas and the complexities of indigenous populations.
Okay.
Furthermore, if those genetic markers were indeed so diluted or obscured over time, why do we see relatively intact genetic signals from other indigenous groups that have been in the Americas for even longer periods? The lack of compelling genetic evidence, coupled with the dominance of the East Asian origin theory, leads me to conclude that the Book of Mormon's claims about the origins of indigenous populations are not supported by current scientific understanding.
I respect your conclusion. However, for many, the spiritual witness of the Book of Mormon's truth transcends the limitations of current scientific understanding.
Okay.
The book's teachings, its stories of faith and redemption, and its power to inspire and guide individuals hold profound meaning, regardless of the ongoing debate about its historical origins.
You've raised a crucial point. The intersection of faith and science is a complex and often personal journey.
Yes.
And while scientific inquiry plays a vital role in our understanding of the world, it's not the only lens through which we can approach questions of belief and spirituality.
So it seems we've reached a point of respectful disagreement.
It seems so.
You find the scientific evidence insufficient to support the Book of Mormon's historicity.
Correct.
While I believe the scientific data, when viewed through the lens of faith and the book's internal narratives, leaves room for both perspectives to coexist.
That's a fair assessment. And perhaps that's the most valuable takeaway for our listeners today.
Yeah.
This deep dive hasn't provided a definitive answer, but it has highlighted the complexity of this issue and encouraged us to think critically, consider multiple perspectives, and engage in respectful dialogue.
Yes.
The Book of Mormon and its relationship to DNA evidence will likely continue to be a topic that invites us to wrestle with questions of faith, science, and history.
Yes.
And that's okay. The journey of seeking understanding, whether through scientific inquiry or spiritual exploration, is an ongoing process and one that can enrich our lives in profound ways.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We encourage you to continue exploring these questions. Delve into the source material we've discussed.
Absolutely.
And engage in thoughtful conversations with others who hold differing viewpoints.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.